It all started with a promise she never made, but was forced to keep. A promise her parents shaped into her destiny without ever asking if it was what she wanted. Alina had always been the dutiful daughter, the one who never raised her voice, never questioned decisions, never thought her life could truly belong to her. In their family, obedience wasn't just expected, it was demanded. And when her father looked at her one evening across the dinner table and casually announced that she would be marrying the son of his business partner, Alina's world shifted in a way she couldn't yet understand. She remembered the silence in that moment, so heavy it pressed against her skin. Her fork froze midway to her mouth, and her mother's eyes darted away as if the shame of complicity was too much to hold. But, Baba, Alina started, her voice trembling. Her father's expression turned sharp instantly. This isn't a discussion, Alina. This is an opportunity. For you, for us, for the family. Don't ruin it with childishness. The words stabbed into her heart, cutting short any protest that might have followed. From that day, the preparations began as if her feelings had never mattered. Relatives flooded the house, speaking of jewelry and venues and the kind of wealth the marriage would bring. She felt like a stranger in her own life, watching her fate be sealed in fabrics and gold, her voice drowned beneath the weight of tradition and ambition. The man she was marrying, Fahad, was someone she barely knew. She had met him at family gatherings before, tall, neatly dressed, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He was polite enough, but distant, as if human connection was something beneath him. As the wedding approached, Alina's nights grew restless. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word her father had spoken. The words echoed like chains around her. Opportunity, family, don't be childish. She wanted to scream that this wasn't an opportunity, but a cage. She wanted to ask her mother why she hadn't said anything, why she hadn't defended her only daughter. But every time Alina looked at her mother, she saw resignation there, a lifetime of silenced dreams mirrored in her tired eyes. The day of the wedding came like a storm. Everyone around her was beaming with pride, but inside Alina felt like she was drowning. The red dress weighed heavy on her body, the gold jewelry biting into her skin. The cameras flashed, people cheered, and she smiled on command, each smile a mask that hid the fear clawing at her chest. Fahad stood tall beside her, his hand cold and firm around hers. They looked perfect together, at least that's what everyone said. But Alina knew perfection was just another word for performance. The first night in her new home was suffocating. The lavish house, with its marble floors and glittering chandeliers, felt less like a home and more like a palace built to remind her of her place. Fahad was polite, yes, but detached. He asked no questions about her dreams, her likes, or her fears. Instead, he spoke about the company his father owned, the investments they were expanding, the travels he planned, with or without her. She realized quickly that she was nothing more than a decorative piece in his world, something to stand beside him in public and stay quiet in private. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Alina learned to move like a ghost in the grand house. Her laughter, once loud and unrestrained, had withered into silence. She tried, in the beginning, to bridge the gap between them. She cooked his favorite meals, asked him about his work, offered her company. But Fahad always looked at her with mild irritation, as if her presence was an inconvenience. "You don't need to worry about these things," he would say dismissively whenever she tried to talk. "Just focus on looking good when we go out." Her heart cracked a little more each day. She realized her marriage wasn't just loveless, it was transactional. Her parents had sold her into a contract, and she was paying the price with her happiness. One evening, she overheard a conversation between Fahad and his father in the study. Their voices carried through the half-open door. "She's quiet, submissive. Just what we needed to secure the partnership with her father. This marriage will keep him loyal to us," his father said. Fahad chuckled, a sound that felt like poison to Alina's ears. "Yes, and she doesn't ask for much. A perfect pawn." The word struck her like a slap. Perfect pawn. That was all she was. A piece on their chessboard, moved around for profit and power. Alina's knees buckled, and she pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself, tears burning in her eyes. She wanted to storm into the room and scream, to tell them she wasn't a pawn, she was a person. But fear glued her to the floor. She crept back to her room, her chest tight, her breath shallow, her spirit breaking under the weight of betrayal. The next morning, she looked at herself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes had lost their spark, her face looked older, worn from the constant strain of pretending. That was the moment something shifted inside her. Beneath the layers of hurt and despair, a seed of resolve began to grow. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't let this continue forever. She couldn't spend her life being their pawn. Still, breaking free wasn't easy. Whenever she spoke to her parents, they reminded her of the sacrifices they had made for her. "This marriage is your duty," her father would say sternly. "You must endure for the family's name." Her mother would nod silently, as if the weight of her own unfulfilled life forced her to agree. Alina wanted to scream at them, to demand if her happiness had ever been part of their calculation. But each time, the words died in her throat, replaced with quiet nods and forced obedience. One evening, as she sat alone on the balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly before her, Alina felt the cold wind brush against her skin. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry freely, no longer hiding her tears behind closed doors. The sobs tore out of her chest, raw and unrestrained. And when they finally subsided, she whispered into the night, "I will not be their pawn forever. One day, they will know who I really am." She didn't yet know how she would do it. She had no plan, no roadmap. But deep inside, a quiet fire had begun to burn. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. A spark of defiance, a promise to herself that this story wasn't over. They might have written the first chapter of her life, but she would write the rest. And in her story, she would no longer be the pawn. They would be the ones left behind. The months after that realization passed slowly, each day dragging heavier than the last. Alina found herself caught in a rhythm of silence and performance. She woke early, dressed carefully, smiled politely at Fahad's family, and accompanied him to gatherings where she was expected to look beautiful, say little, and never contradict him. In public, people often praised their marriage. They called her lucky, admired the expensive clothes she wore, envied the mansion she lived in. Alina smiled when they spoke like that, but inside she wanted to laugh bitterly. What they saw was a glittering cage. What they envied was her prison. Fahad grew more distant as time went on. He traveled frequently for business, sometimes gone for weeks, and when he returned, he carried with him the smell of perfume that wasn't hers. At first, Alina tried to ignore it, telling herself she was imagining things. But then one evening, as she collected his jacket to hang in the closet, she found a lipstick mark on the collar. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling as she stared at it. The color was bright red, nothing like the soft shades she wore. She waited for him that night, her heart pounding with dread and anger, but when she confronted him, he didn't even flinch. "You think I owe you an explanation?" Fahad scoffed, loosening his tie as if her accusation was beneath him. "Don't forget why you're here, Alina. This marriage is about business, not love. If you're smart, you'll stop asking questions and enjoy the life you've been given." His words stung, sharp and merciless, leaving her frozen in disbelief. He didn't even deny it. He didn't care enough to hide his betrayal. That night, Alina lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling. She felt humiliation burning in her veins, anger twisting inside her chest, but most of all, she felt a new kind of clarity. The illusion was broken. Whatever fragile hope she had held onto, that maybe he would grow to love her, that maybe things would change, was gone. Now she saw the truth clearly. She was nothing to him, nothing but a possession, a name on paper, a pawn in his father's game. Her parents visited a few weeks later, and Alina thought maybe she could finally confide in her mother. But when she tried, her father shut her down immediately. "Don't bring shame to us, Alina," he said firmly, his voice low and commanding. "Marriage is never easy. You must endure. Do you want the world to say we failed to raise a good daughter? That we couldn't keep our promises?" His words stabbed her deeper than any of Fahad's betrayals. Even her own parents didn't see her as a person. They saw her as their reputation. Her mother sat silently beside him, her eyes fixed on the carpet, her hands twisting in her lap. Alina wanted to grab her mother's hands, shake her, beg her to say something, anything. But when her mother finally looked up, all she saw was resignation. It was as if her mother's silence was her way of saying, "I lived like this too. And so will you." After they left, Alina locked herself in her room and cried until she couldn't breathe. For the first time, she realized she was utterly alone. She couldn't rely on her husband. She couldn't rely on her parents. There was no one to rescue her, no one to fight for her. If she wanted freedom, if she wanted dignity, she would have to fight for it herself. The days that followed became a battle of endurance. Fahad's indifference turned to cruelty. He criticized her constantly, her cooking, her appearance, even the way she spoke. He compared her to other women, sometimes even in front of friends. Each insult chipped away at her, but instead of crumbling, Alina began to store them away like stones in her chest. Every harsh word, every humiliation, every betrayal became fuel for something growing inside her. She no longer cried in front of him. She no longer begged for affection. Instead, she watched, she listened, and slowly she began to think. Fahad may have seen her as a pawn, but Alina was beginning to understand the board. She started noticing details she had ignored before. The way Fahad relied heavily on his father's approval, the way their business associates always looked past him and deferred to his father, the way the company seemed to be stretched thin despite their show of wealth. She paid attention during family dinners, listening carefully as the men discussed deals and contracts, memorizing names and numbers. They never noticed her silence because they never expected her to matter. That invisibility, she realized, could become her strength. At the same time, she began to carve out small pieces of freedom for herself. She asked Fahad for spending money, pretending it was for clothes and jewelry, but instead she began saving quietly, bit by bit, hiding the cash where he would never look. She befriended the household staff, treating them with kindness that Fahad never showed. Soon they began to confide in her, telling her things they overheard, things she could use. One afternoon, as she sat with the maid in the kitchen, sipping tea, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "Madam, have you heard? Sir is trying to sell part of his father's land secretly. They say the business is in debt." Alina's eyes widened, but she kept her face calm. She nodded slowly, thanked the maid, and tucked the information away in her mind. So it was true. The empire wasn't as strong as they pretended. Cracks were forming. That night, Alina stood on the balcony again, the wind tangling her hair, her mind racing. For the first time, she felt a strange sense of control. They thought she was powerless, but they were wrong. She was learning their secrets. She was watching their weaknesses. And one day, she would use all of it. But until then, she played her part. She smiled in public, stayed quiet at home, endured Fahad's coldness. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. She was no longer the broken girl staring at the ceiling in despair. She was something new, something stronger, sharper. She was a woman with a plan forming in the shadows of her heart. The turning point came one evening when Fahad returned from a trip in a drunken rage. He accused her of disrespecting him, of not being grateful enough for the life he provided. His words were slurred, his anger wild, and for the first time he raised his hand against her. The slap echoed through the room, leaving her cheek burning and her ears ringing. For a moment, Alina stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Then, slowly, she lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no fear in her gaze anymore. No pleading, no desperation. Only quiet, simmering defiance. Fahad seemed startled by it, as if he had expected her to crumble, to cry, to beg. But she didn't. She stood tall, her eyes locked on his, and in that moment she knew, this was the line. He had broken something inside her, but in doing so, he had also unleashed something he could never control. That night, long after he had passed out, Alina sat by the window with her notebook. She began to write, not poetry, not dreams, but plans. Detailed notes of everything she had learned, every weakness she had observed, every secret she could use. She wrote until dawn, her hand aching, her eyes burning, but her spirit alive in a way it hadn't been for years. By the time the sun rose, Alina was no longer the woman her father had ordered into this marriage. She was no longer the pawn Fahad and his family believed they owned. She was something entirely different now, a player in the game, and one who intended to win. The morning after she filled her notebook with plans, Alina woke with a different kind of energy. Her cheeks still throbbed faintly from Fahad's slap, but instead of shame, she felt a burning determination. She no longer looked at her reflection with despair. She looked at herself with purpose. The woman in the mirror was no longer just surviving, she was preparing. The first step of her plan was patience. She knew revenge was not something to be rushed. She had to be careful, strategic, invisible until the moment was right. She continued playing the role they had written for her, the quiet, obedient wife who smiled on cue and asked no questions. But behind that mask, she was working tirelessly. Every word overheard at business dinners, every careless boast Fahad made when he was drunk, every slip of paper she found on his desk. She collected it all, building a map of their empire's cracks. One of her discoveries was particularly useful. Fahad's father had taken out massive loans to maintain the illusion of wealth. The family company was drowning, but they hid it behind extravagant parties and luxury cars. Fahad, spoiled and reckless, was secretly trying to sell land without his father's knowledge, desperate to cover his gambling debts. Alina wrote all of it down, every detail, every number. She wasn't just watching anymore, she was preparing to strike. But revenge wasn't only about money. It was about dignity. Alina wanted Fahad and her parents to feel the same humiliation, the same helplessness they had forced upon her. She started by slowly withdrawing her emotions from Fahad. When he insulted her, she smiled faintly, as if his words didn't matter. When he came home late smelling of perfume, she looked at him with a calm indifference that unsettled him more than anger ever could. He began to sense that he no longer had control over her, and that loss of power gnawed at him. Her second move was building allies. The staff in the house, who had once pitted her, now trusted her. She treated them with respect, helped them when they needed, and in return, they told her everything. She knew who Fahad met when he claimed to be on business trips. She knew which associates doubted the company's stability. She even knew which board members were secretly waiting for the chance to jump ship. Piece by piece, she built a web of information so strong that when she pulled the strings, everything would collapse. Months passed, and the day she had been waiting for finally came. Fahad invited her to a grand party, a celebration meant to showcase their family's success. Important investors, business rivals, and even her own parents were there, glowing with pride. Alina wore a stunning gown, her hair pinned elegantly, her expression serene. She walked beside Fahad, the perfect wife in every way. No one suspected what she carried in her clutch, a small folder filled with documents she had carefully copied from Fahad's office. As the evening went on, Fahad boasted about the company's growth, raising glasses of champagne, promising profits and expansion. Alina stood quietly at his side, her eyes scanning the room, watching the faces of the investors. When the moment felt right, she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Before we all celebrate," she said, her words cutting through the chatter like glass, "perhaps the investors should know the truth." The room fell silent. Fahad turned to her, stunned, his face tightening. "Alina, what are you doing?" he hissed under his breath. But she didn't flinch. She opened the folder and spread the papers on the table. Loan documents, secret sales, gambling receipts. Gasps echoed around the room as investors leaned forward, eyes widening with shock. "This," Alina continued, her voice steady, "is what you've been hiding. Debt, corruption, betrayal. You've built an empire on lies. And tonight those lies end." Fahad lunged toward her, his face red with rage, but by then it was too late. The investors had seen enough. Whispers spread like wildfire. Phones were pulled out. Board members exchanged furious glances. Fahad's father, pale and trembling, shouted at his son, but his voice was drowned in the chaos. Alina stood calmly in the center of it all, her heart racing but her expression serene. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the silent pawn. She was the one controlling the game. Her parents watched from across the room, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. Alina met their eyes and held their gaze. She wanted them to see what she had become. The obedient daughter they had sacrificed for reputation was gone. In her place stood a woman who had taken back her power. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within days, Fahad's father's company collapsed. Investors pulled out, board members resigned, and scandals flooded the newspapers. Fahad's reputation was destroyed, his arrogance crumbling into desperation. He tried to confront Alina, screaming that she had ruined him, but she simply looked at him with the same calm indifference she had mastered. "No," she told him quietly. "You ruined yourself. I only showed them the truth." Her parents came to her, begging her to think of the family's name, to undo what she had done. But Alina only smiled bitterly. "You taught me to endure for the family's name. Now you can endure the consequences of your choices. This is what your ambition bought." With the money she had quietly saved, along with support from some of the very investors who admired her courage, Alina began building her own path. She started a small venture, one rooted in honesty and respect, and slowly it grew. People who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a decorative wife now saw her as a woman of strength and intelligence. Her reputation became her own, not borrowed from a father or a husband. Years later, when she stood in her own office, sunlight streaming through the windows, she thought of the girl she had once been. The girl forced into a marriage, silenced by her family, broken by betrayal. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had risen from the ashes, who had taken the very chains meant to bind her and forged them into armor. And though she rarely spoke of the past, sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would whisper to herself the promise she had once made on a lonely balcony. I will not be their pawn forever. She smiled then, because she had kept that promise. And in keeping it, she had won.